Thank you for that very warm introduction. That was very kind of you. So again, I'm Melissa. I always say, you can just say, this is Melissa from Monmouth. We don't have to read my whole page. But again, thank you for that very generous introduction. The real reason I'm here, if you weed through all that stuff that it says on my faculty webpage, the real reason I'm here is because I was the last command historian at Fort Monmouth prior to the base closure. And when the base closed in 2011, as you noted, I resigned rather than leave the great state of New Jersey. I was not moving to Maryland, as if. But I was pregnant, I was a little hormonal, I was crying all the time, and I was like, I am not going to let New Jersey forget all of the amazing things that the men and women, military and civilian, who worked here did. The Army took the museum, the Army took the archive, but I did not want to let New Jersey forget that this was our history. This is New Jersey history as much as it's military history. And so, here we are today still, ever since the base closed. Whenever I can, I get out in the community and I lecture on different Fort Monmouth history topics, even when, yes, my career takes me in a different direction. Bruce Springsteen, although I'll have you know, Bruce Springsteen did play at Fort Monmouth many times, from the 1960s in the Teen Club all the way through the height of his fame, when the fort provided a secure place to rehearse without fans tracking you down. But I digress. But I know I'm not the only Fort Monmouth employee in the audience. I want to make sure I acknowledge my fellow fort folk like George and Bob in the front row here. Actually, can I have a show of hands? Anyone who was stationed at or worked at Fort Monmouth as a civilian? Thank you, everybody. So we are going to spend roughly 45 minutes doing an overview of the fort, and then we'll take some Q&A. Of course, this could be a semester-long class. I keep waiting. Every day I wake up, I'm like, where's my invitation to do a semester-long class? It hasn't come yet, unfortunately. But it could be a semester-long class, just like this book that some of you generously purchased could be a 10-volume series. There is just so much to say. Literally every year, part of my job in the Command Historical Office was to write the annual command history, which would be like 500 to 800 pages, just for a year's worth of stuff, okay? I could not sell the publisher on a 10-volume series, so we did what we could in the book. If your piece of Fort Monmouth history is not covered in tonight's talk or not covered in the book, it's just a matter of doing what you can in the time and space allowed. So apologies in advance if I leave anyone's favorite piece of the history out. One more thing, if I may, about the new book before we launch into the talk. As we noted, my author's royalties are being donated to the Info Age Science and History Museums at the Camp Evans National Historic Landmark. I'm not a martyr. There's actually not a lot of money to be made from a no-name author like me on a book like this, but it's the thought that counts, right? So if you purchased a book, it's going towards a good cause. I would also like to acknowledge Fred Carl, the founder of InfoAge, who's in the audience. Fred, if you can raise a hand there. InfoAge is what it is today because of Fred and the many other volunteers who make that place so great. So, okay, with all that, let us dive in. Fort Monmouth was founded just after the United States entered World War I. You're history buffs, so you probably don't need that much of a reminder, but the Great War, as it was then called, broke out in 1914 after a man named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, in June of 1914. Recall that country after country declares war on each other for a complex series of reasons, mainly these mutual defense treaties. The countries of Europe tend to think that this war will be over relatively quickly. We know that that's not going to be the case. By August of 1914, millions of Europeans are at war. And where does the United States stand in all this? Well, of course, when World War I erupted in 1914, the United States is, industrializing rapidly. There's a tremendous creation of wealth. We are starting to undergo a progressive movement to try to mitigate some of the problems caused by industrialization. So the United States is very busy doing its own thing. There's very little appetite in the Woodrow Wilson administration or in the general populace to get involved in this European crisis. So neutrality is initially the United States' stance. We know, of course, that America does eventually get involved in the war, right, due to things like the Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of merchant vessels by U-boats, some of them, not far off our coast here. Over 4 million Americans will ultimately serve in uniform during World War I. About 2 million will make it over to Europe. About 1 million will see combat. The U.S. economy, which, as I noted, was industrializing greatly in the decades following the American Civil War, we will also churn out a vast supply of raw materials and munitions in support of the war effort. Now, when America does get into the war in 1917, it is still unclear who will win. The war had become this protracted stalemate marked by gruesome trench warfare. But the arrival of large numbers of Americans will eventually turn the tide of the war decisively in the Allies' favor. Of course, tragically, the resolution of World War I, and particularly the Treaty of Versailles, will set up the circumstances that eventually lead us into World War II. But we'll get to that in just a bit. So it is out of this crisis, America's entry into World War I, that Fort Monmouth is born. When the U.S. Army when the U.S. government declares war in 1917, our Army is very, very tiny, right? That's going to be our primary fighting force, and it's tiny. It's roughly 200,000 strong. That is nowhere near the size that would be needed to make a difference in this war. And so the Army has to grow very, very rapidly. Now, within that Army, this particular branch, the U.S. Army Signal Corps, was going to be very, very important. The Signal Corps is the branch of the Army charged with all manner of military communications. It traces its roots to the Civil War era, when they were using wigwag flags, for signaling. So why is the Signal Corps going to be so important in World War I? Well, it's a modern war, right? The types of communications that they're going to want to use, and it's a war that's being fought over a very vast expanse, right? So communications was going to be particularly important. I told you that the Army was roughly 200,000 strong. The Signal Corps is roughly 55 officers and 1,500 men. Totally, woefully insufficient to help the Army that's going to be raised participate meaningfully in this conflict. So as we get into the war, and as we start rapidly growing the Army, growing the Signal Corps is of particular concern to military planners. So the Army starts looking for land for additional Signal Corps training camps throughout the country, and their investigation leads them to some land in Monmouth County where the old Monmouth Park Racetrack and Luxury Hotel had been. Not where Monmouth Park Racetrack currently is, but on what's going to become Fort Monmouth. This particular racetrack, this first Monmouth Park racetrack, flourished during the latter half of the 19th century when Gilded Age elite flocked to Monmouth County, and they built their homes in Long Branch to enjoy the sea breezes, right? Think of 7 presidents, deciding to vacation here in this area. So there's a group of investors who get together and they're like, hey, there's a lot of rich people hanging around here at the Jersey Shore. Let's give them something to do and make some money off of them. And so they come up with this Monmouth Park racetrack. All of the, rich and people of the wealthy and famous people of the day wanted to be at the racetrack. People magazine would have been all over these folks, right? The racetrack has a relatively short lifespan because the New Jersey legislature is going to outlaw gambling. They don't outlaw horse racing per se, but it turns out people don't want to watch horses chase each other if they can't potentially make money off of it, right? And so ultimately, the racetrack is going to close. The Monmouth Park Racetrack Hotel, which, was just opulent and beautiful, it winds up burning to the ground. The grandstand, which was reportedly one of the largest in the world at the time, comes down in a nor'easter in 1899. And so the Army is looking for land for Signal Corps training camps. They come across this land in Monmouth County. A lot of it is overgrown and largely infested with poison ivy. Some of it is being used for farming. They come across the land and they find that the gentleman that owns most of it is a guy by the name of Melvin Van Kuren. Charles Corlett, who is leading this New Jersey search on behalf of the Army, he recalls in a 1955 interview that he, quote, finally stumbled onto the old race course near Eatontown. I found part of the old steel grandstand with railroad sidings behind it, the old 2-mile straightaway track and 2 oval racetracks, all badly overgrown with weeds and underbrush. Upon inquiry, I learned that the land belonged to an old man who lived in Eatontown, who was very ill, on his deathbed, in fact. But when he learned my business, he was anxious to see me. As the story goes, Corlett learns that Van Kuren had offered to give the land to the Army free of charge during the Spanish-American War. And he's like, well, sure, we'll take it now. And Van Kuren's like, no, not anymore. He doesn't want to give it up for free anymore. They strike a deal where the Army is going to lease the site because initially they think they're only going to need it for the duration of World War I. And so the Army leases the land from Van Kuren in May of 1917 with an option to buy. A few things make this site appealing to the Army, because you might be sitting there like, Melissa, you just said it was a jungle of weeds and underbrush. Why does the Army want this site? It's in close proximity to Hoboken, which was going to be a major port of embarkation shipping those troops over to Europe. Its proximity to the passenger terminal in Little Silver to get men in and out pretty quickly. There are a lot of good stone roads going to the site from when everybody was traveling there to go to the racetrack. So that's less infrastructure that the Army has to build. They might have to do some clearing, but it's less that they have to build from scratch. And there's also access to water there from Oceanport Creek and other things. So the first 30 or so Signal soldiers arrive at what's going to become Fort Monmouth. Behind me are some early photos of troops' arrival. Virtually all of the photos you see this evening, unless otherwise noted, come from the archive that was formerly at Fort Monmouth. So that's some early arrivals. The installation was originally called by the Army Camp Little Silver, or the Signal Corps Camp at Little Silver, just based on its proximity there to Little Silver. But locals called it all manner of things. A lot of the locals referred to it as Camp Monmouth Park, just because it was the camp that was sitting on what they knew as Monmouth Park. There's an article behind me that talks about at Camp Monmouth Park. General orders dated 17 June 1917 named this gentleman, Carl F. Hartman, the first commander of Camp Little Silver. The Oceanport Avenue entrance to the fort, for those of you who are familiar, that's the Hartman Gate in honor of the first commander, Carl F. Hartman. So behind me is a 1919 map. I'm sorry, sometimes my screens are bigger than the others, so I'm sorry if it's hard for you to see. But that arrow is pointing out Oceanport Avenue. The first camp was clustered down by Oceanport Avenue. I think we think of the big brick gates as the main post to the fort, but no one was down there originally. The original camp was down by Oceanport Avenue. Corporal Carl L. Whitehurst was among the first soldiers to arrive at Camp Little Silver. And he writes that the site is, quote, a jungle of weeds, poison ivy, briars, and underbrush. He's not impressed. There are also 129 soldiers who are hospitalized with extreme poison ivy in July. So they come in and they're really working hard to clear this site out through the New Jersey spring and summer. Whitehurst writes about how remnants of the old Monmouth Park racetrack seem to be everywhere, but in those early days, if they need shelter, the only place to go is in the former ticket booth from the racetrack. The arrow behind me points out the ticket booth. The photo on the bottom gives you a relatively modern aerial of the top photo. So just to give you an idea that ticket booth was, again, near Oceanport Avenue. This is the ticket booth up close. Unfortunately, all these years, 20 years of doing Fort Monmouth history, and I've not yet pinned down when the ticket booth came down. It's not there anymore, but I'm not sure exactly when it came down. So the men come in, they're clearing out the site. They are initially all in tents. Whoops. There you go. You can see that they're initially in tents, and then lumber will come, and with the lumber, they build barracks. Unfortunately, most of the lumber that arrives is green, and so they're trying to build these barracks in less than ideal conditions. As Corporal Whitehurst writes, by the time the wood was dried out, it was winter, and in December, there were cracks you could put your finger through. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was a tough one, and sometimes the snow would pile up on your blankets, coming through the gaps in the boards. So what I'm going to do now is walk you through some of that early construction that takes place at the camp during the World War I era. You can see the mess hall, and that's an interior of the mess hall, nice and orderly. You can see the cooks at work there, the enlisted men's barracks, the officers' quarters, which, as you can imagine, look a little nicer inside than the enlisted men's barracks. This is the library, barber shop, blacksmith, the post exchange, the post office, the Western Union office. I love those haircuts on these gentlemen. The Red Cross building. I love the Model T, I think that is in the front. Knights of Columbus. There was a lot of concern as you go back and look at the records at giving the men wholesome entertainment so that they wouldn't be out carousing and causing trouble in the local communities. This is a sample office space. I keep meaning, and then I forget because I get busy, to swap this photo out and use one that shows women, because I think it's noteworthy that from the very beginning, the base employed local civilian women, and they were jobs that were much sought after because they paid more than women could make most other places working locally. This is the rather unassuming camp headquarters before they build Russell Hall, permanent construction. And, I think looking at all of that construction, they built really their own self-contained city there. I think looking at the construction is one way to think about the growth, but I always much prefer photos of the men who were stationed there, and it was only men, in uniform during World War I, because they really worked hard. This is a postcard you could have gotten in like the PX. It says breaking them in Camp Vale. They played hard. This is the Camp Vale band performing over there. I keep saying Camp Vale, forgive me. So it's initially called Camp Little Silver, and then it's called Camp Alfred Vale in honor of the New Jersey inventor who helped Samuel Morse develop commercial telegraphy. So it becomes Camp Vale during World War I. And in the post-war years, I'll mention in a moment that it becomes Fort Monmouth. And, when I look at photos of the men, be it from World War I or from any era, I'm always struck by the fact that some of them didn't get to come back to the fort, unfortunately. So, I think we always have to keep in mind that the focus there was always on the soldier. And while being stationed at Fort Monmouth becomes quite a plum assignment, not everyone got to return home because the missions really were deadly. Ultimately, Camp Alfred Vale is going to prepare several battalions for war. You can see a signal soldier in the field there. To give you an idea of the head count, the camp trained some 2,400 enlisted men and 440 officers for war in 1917, and some 1,000 officers and 9,000 enlisted men in 1918. With all of those people living and working in such close quarters, it's worth noting that the camp was really hard hit by the influenza pandemic that struck the nation in the fall of 1918, which we all, having lived through a pandemic of our own, can understand. As outbreaks occurred, the units were quarantined, and then they eventually wind up quarantining the entire camp. Ultimately, we'll see about 300 people hospitalized and 11 deaths. Now, in addition to the wartime training, taking civilians, making them Signal Corps soldiers, in addition to that work, Camp Alfred Vale, later Fort Monmouth, had a research and development mission from the very beginning. The Army wanted its own laboratories independent of the commercial labs. Much of the laboratory's work during the World War I years focused on wireless communications, to include air-to-ground radio. You can see the airplane hangars where the Signal Corps kept their planes to test out the air-to-ground radios. It's funny, I write a lot in the book about the relationship that develops between Fort Monmouth and Monmouth County, because this is a book not written for the military, it's written for New Jersey. So I write a lot about that relationship, and from the beginning, the people of Monmouth County were so supportive of the base at every turn, taking soldiers into their home for Sunday dinner, for the holidays. The one thing I see them complain about a lot is the airplanes. They hated the airplanes. They were so loud. They were flying all hours of the day and night. They did not like the airplanes. In addition to helping to make the world safe for democracy, both by training Signal Corps troops and helping to innovate equipment that would help the U.S. Army win wars, the base was a huge boon for the local economy from the very beginning. You all may recall, right, the discussions when they were talking about whether or not to close Fort Monmouth from 2005 to 2011. Those discussions are ongoing. There was a lot of concern about the economic impact. Well, those economic impacts had been going on for 90 plus years. I mean, from the very beginning, the fort created a lot of jobs on site for local civilians. The soldiers and civilians who were working at Camp Alfred Vale, they had money in their pocket to then go out and spend in the local communities. And we see families and friends coming to Fort Monmouth, staying in the hotels, eating in restaurants, because they want to be close to their loved ones who are stationed there. So from the very beginning, the military's presence was a financial boon for Monmouth County. Now, I said we win World War I, spoiler alert, sorry. We win World War I, and that should have meant the end of Camp Alfred Vale, but there are people who are calling it the best Signal Corps camp ever established anywhere. And so the chief signal officer decides they're going to keep Camp Alfred Vale open. They will wind up purchasing over 400 acres for a little over $115,000. I don't think you can buy like a shed in Monmouth County for for $115,000 today. And this is when the installation will receive permanent status, and in 1925, the name Fort Monmouth, in honor of the men and women of the American Revolution who had fought at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in 1778. Fort Monmouth would soon be known as the home of the Signal Corps. Now we come into the interwar years, and it's in the interwar years that we see the first permanent construction occur at Fort Monmouth, because the base is now permanent. So the first permanent structure is the barracks building on Barker Circle. That's along Oceanport Avenue there. And permanent construction continues throughout the 1930s, some of the construction funded by WPA dollars. This was another time when it was really good for the local population, because there were a lot of jobs and construction there on the base at the height of the Great Depression. So it was really appreciated that locals will put to work helping to build these facilities. Other early construction included Russell Hall, the firehouse, and a post theater, which would later be used as a museum. Now, again, you're history buffs, so you know that the American military was not in the habit of keeping a large peacetime force until after World War II. And so the military discharges a lot, it draws down. There's less of a training mission at Fort Monmouth in the 1930s, but the research and development continues on and on. In fact, during the interwar years, the scientists of the research and development laboratories at Fort Monmouth develop, among many other things, the first U.S. aircraft detection radars. You can see Colonel William Blair here. He's a one-time director of the Signal Corps Labs at Fort Monmouth. After World War II, when the security classifications have gone away, he will ultimately get the patent for the first U.S. aircraft detection radars, and he gets written about as the father of radar. In fact, Fort Monmouth radars actually detect the incoming Japanese planes at Pearl Harbor. And I know there are some of you in the audience who could probably tell this story even better than me, George, Fred, but there are Fort Monmouth radars at Pearl Harbor. There are young Signal Corps soldiers who are manning those radars, and they detect the planes and they call in to headquarters as they were told to do. And they're told, it's probably birds, or it's our own planes, like you're at the end of your shift, just call it a day. And you can, in real time, kind of look at the archival record and see, while that's happening at Pearl Harbor, well, what's happening at Fort Monmouth, where the men who developed these radars are. At first, the team who developed these radars, they're horrified because they think their radar must have failed. They feel terrible. And then eventually they learn, no, the radars worked, but because the technology was so new, the warnings weren't heeded. There is a radar technician, John Marchetti, and he's asked, when you heard about Pearl Harbor, how did you feel? And he replied, I was furious. The radar that had been built was completely misused. It could have saved lives at Pearl Harbor. And so to this day, historians debate what actually might have changed if they had had a little bit of warning. But, of course, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, we do then enter a second World War. World War II is going to really significantly impact Fort Monmouth. Again, it's a little hard to see here, but on top, we have a 1936 map. Again, everything is clustered towards Oceanport Avenue. This map is only to the right of the arrow here, right? So look at the tremendous growth, all of this, and of course, everything coming out then to Route 35. So that map gives you an idea of the tremendous construction that is needed on Main Post to accommodate the missions undertaken during World War II. In fact, all all of this construction on Main Post is not enough. They need to go down the road to the Charleswood area. They need to go to Camp Evans in Wall Township. They need to use Convention Hall and luxury hotels in Asbury Park. They wind up scooping up real estate all throughout Monmouth, a little bit in Ocean, counties, trying to accommodate their missions. This is a map that just kind of shows you different points that Fort Monmouth will wind up expanding out into. So, Fort Monmouth laboratory developments during the World War II period are going to work to make communications more transportable, more secure, and more reliable. So again, just as the fort had done during World War I, they are both training soldiers at the signal school and the Officer Candidate School, and then innovating the technologies that the soldiers need in order to communicate effectively on the battlefield and achieve victory. Some of the developments of the World War II period include early FM backpack radios. They were constantly trying to push communications lower and lower down in the fields. So if you can miniaturize the equipment, you can make it so that you can deploy more, so that the average soldier can carry it, etc. So we see, smaller and smaller radios. We see the deployment of different iterations of radar technologies, etc. It is during the World War II years that we also see the first female soldiers arrive at Fort Monmouth after Congress first grants women the right to serve with and then in the military with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and then the Women's Army Corps. So the headline of the Fort Monmouth newspaper when women arrive reads, "Vanguard of Women's Army Corps arrives to plan invasion of fort." And the article warns men to straighten their ties and comb their hair, to press their uniforms more carefully than ever, because a new impetus has been added to life at Fort Monmouth. Now, this article, those words I read you, they're a little playful, but the Signal Corps was actually quite advanced in its advocacy for women in the military. The Signal Corps had used contracted civilian telephone operators known as the Hello Girls during World War I. They provided communications for Pershing himself quite close to the battlefield. So they had used women. They knew women were really successful. In fact, those women connected calls more successfully and far more quickly than the men who'd been trying to do it before them. And so when World War II comes and Congress is debating, if we use women, will it cast a shadow over the sanctity of the home? There's one quote in the congressional record, and it's like, who will do the cooking, the washing, the mending, the humble home tasks to which every woman has devoted herself? Like, the debates in the congressional record are really something. But the Signal Corps is actually at the forefront of saying, no, women can do this, we need them. So I think that's quite interesting. Also, in addition to being kind of advanced in its use of women, the Signal Corps at Fort Monmouth is pretty progressive in its employment of African Americans. It's in the late 1940s and 1950s that Fort Monmouth earns a reputation as Black Brain Center of the United States. Now, that is not a title I come up with. It would not be appropriate for me to bestow that title on Fort Monmouth. There's an electrical engineer, Thomas Daniels, who actually coins that phrase. And Daniels and others affirm that the Post, quote, provided a place where Black scientists and engineers could find jobs and advance their careers while other research facilities closed their doors to African Americans. InfoAge, I would lose the rest of my time if I told you all the great things InfoAge has to offer, but one thing I do want to point out is that InfoAge has a tremendous Black history exhibit, and that Fred and some of the pioneering Black personnel are currently in the midst of an oral history project to make sure we document as many of these stories as possible. One of the African-American pioneers at Fort Monmouth, Dr. Walter McAfee, was critical in helping the fort's Evans Signal Lab achieve a milestone in scientific history on January 10th, 1946, when scientists significantly bounce electronic signals off the moon in Project Diana. Now today, we might be like, oh, they bounced radar signals off the moon. Oh, okay. At the time, this feat was put in the same category as like the atomic bomb. I mean, it was seen as enormously influential and indicating that we could have these communications across vast distances of space. There are many people who say that that is really the start of the space age. Some of the other achievements of the post-World War II era include work on the first weather radar, the first communications satellite, the first weather satellites, the first televised weather satellites. I'll conclude my talk by showing a picture of a phone, and I'll say, basically, look at all the apps on your phone. A lot of the things you see there trace their roots to Fort Monmouth and to Camp Evans. As we continue along our chronology here, we come upon the Korean War, and our automatic artillery and mortar locating radars are a major success of the Korean War era. Basically, the idea is to help soldiers locate the source of incoming enemy attacks and accurately direct their counterfire. Other developments of the post-World War II era include things like lightweight field television cameras, pocket radiation detectors, ever smaller field radios, right? They're trying to get those radios smaller and smaller and smaller, as I noted. In fact, advancements in communications and electronics equipment are coming so far that in 1957, the Army decides it is going to discontinue the pigeon service. And you might be like, what was the Army doing with a pigeon service? Well, Fort Monmouth was, from the end of World War I through 1957, home of the Army's pigeon breeding and training section. The Army used pigeons quite successfully in World War I, World War II, and Korea. They trained the birds to deliver their message very successfully. I've seen some estimates that they delivered up to 95% of their messages successfully. They trained them to fly two-way missions. They trained them to fly under cover of darkness. And they tracked these birds' service records. They got medals from the U.S. Army and from other countries. There were other countries that gave our birds medals. It wasn't like we had just lost our minds. Other countries were giving our birds medals. So the birds were quite a thing. In fact, the soldiers knew and respected the birds so much that I would often get asked, what's your favorite item in the archive? And it's hard. You can't pick a favorite item. It's like picking your favorite child. You can't do that. But one of my favorites was a handwritten letter from a soldier in Vietnam who writes back to the commander at Fort Monmouth and says, "Sir," I'm paraphrasing a little, but, "Sir, all of these gadgets you're sending us, fine, they're great, but the batteries die, the water messes them up, we don't know how to use them, can you just send us some pigeons," right? And that makes me laugh because it shows, right, that there was respect amongst, the soldiers for these birds. But anyway, no, Fort Monmouth decides they're discontinuing the pigeon service. Up to this point, if you were a distinguished hero pigeon, when you died, you were taxidermied and you got to live in a museum. Many of them lived at Fort Monmouth in the museum and in the library. So at the time that the pigeon service is discontinued, the living heroes, they were sent to zoos across the country. And zoos would start like lobbying campaigns to try to get a Fort Monmouth hero pigeon. It was really a thing. And then the regular old, GI pigeons, they were sold for $5 a pair. And we've got photos. People are lined up as far as the eye can see to buy a pigeon from Fort Monmouth. Now, Fort Monmouth is right on the front lines of the Cold War. We've got training of troops and our research and development missions continuing apace. I'll share just a couple Cold War vignettes because I know I'm running out of time. When the Russians launched Sputnik in October of 1957, the Deal Test Area, everybody, the Deal Test Area is the first government installation in the United States to detect and record the Russian signals. The Deal Test Area is used by the Army in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Dr. Harold Zal, who is at one point the Fort Monmouth Director of Research, says, quote, "We had no legal project set up for tracking Russian satellites, but within our own laboratory, we saw immediate potential and duty called." He says, quote, "A small, select group of Signal Corps R&D personnel who called ourselves the Royal Order of Sputnik Chasers vowed to work without overtime pay 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until we learned all there was to be learned from the mysterious electronic invader carrying the hammer and sickle." So maybe I'll come back another day and we could do a whole hour just on the history of the Deal Test Site. Another kind of Cold War era vignette I would note, I know you can't read this, this is a memo that talks about something called Project Paperclip or Operation Paperclip. In the aftermath of World War II, the Americans and the Soviets were in a race to scoop up German scientific personnel because they didn't want the other side to get that expertise. And so there are German scientists who are brought to the United States to include to Fort Monmouth under Operation Paperclip. And, they live out the rest of their lives here contributing to U.S. Army missions. Again, that could be an entire hour-long talk of its own easily. And Fort Monmouth was regrettably the site of one of Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts. He becomes convinced that there's a spy ring operating at Fort Monmouth in Camp Evans, and there are many, many people who are suspended from their jobs on, suspicions of this or that without any real evidence. It's a very difficult time for everyone at the base, particularly those who are being persecuted, many, if not most of whom were Jewish employees of the base. Again, that could be another whole, I told you it could be a semester-long class. As we come through our chronology and into Vietnam, Fort Monmouth really becomes the eyes and ears of the Army. In the words of one employee, quote, "We had always provided the voice, but the eyes and ears, I think, was the big thing that came out of Southeast Asia." So we're talking about, we've been doing radios and radars really well for decades now in the mortar locators, but sensors, surveillance systems, aerial reconnaissance equipment, air traffic control systems, night vision devices, the suite of technologies being innovated or procured or sustained by the personnel at Fort Monmouth just kept growing and growing as the years went on. And as the 20th century comes to a close, Fort Monmouth personnel, again, they work round the clock to equip soldiers during the Gulf War with everything they need, from jammers to night vision. But I will note, from the Vietnam War era forward, we're going to see fewer and fewer uniformed military at the base and more civilians. There had been a mix going back to the beginning, to World War I. But the signal school, which had been so critical, that was the very reason for the base's existence in the beginning, and then, they had R&D labs too. But the signal school during the Vietnam era is going to completely transition to Fort Gordon, Georgia. There's a lot that goes into it, but it is really a practical matter of space. I'll give you an example. There's an oral history with a soldier. He's supposed to be doing night maneuvers, training, pretending he's in Vietnam, and he writes, "I could hear the music and see the lights from the bars on Route 35. It was really ruining the mojo." We were out of space here to do what we needed to do, and so they start to transition the signal school down. So as we're coming now, looking at the end of the 20th century, Fort Monmouth is becoming more and more civilian. That does not mean the work being done there is any less important. Everything the civilian does is for the soldier, but it's a different look and feel on the base that's important to note. Now, as we come into the 21st century, Fort Monmouth is as relevant as ever. In the wake of the September 11th terrorist attacks, we have civilian and contractor personnel from Fort Monmouth who deployed to Ground Zero in New York and to the Pentagon to assist with recovery efforts in a variety of ways. For example, the teams are deployed to New York City and charged with trying to find survivors in the rubble by locating their cell phones. Remember, initially there was a hope that we might find large numbers of survivors in the rubble before we realized how catastrophic that collapse was. And so when they're thinking about, well, how are we going to locate them? They're thinking, well, if we can find their cell phones, right? Right now, I can go on my cell phone and tell you where every single member of my family is, right, with the Find My Friends app. That didn't exist then, right? Cell phones were, commercial civilian cell phones were in their infancy in 2001. And so we at Fort Monmouth happened to have this technology that could locate cell phones. And so that gets sent up to New York quickly. The problem is twofold. One, there are not many survivors, and the cell phone pings they are getting belong to the rescue workers who are working the rubble. So that's something we try, but it's not enormously successful. They also send up small infrared cameras attached to PVC pipe to try to look through voids in the rubble. There's something called a laser Doppler vibrometer, which is brought up to measure for slight vibrations so that they could warn rescue workers if there was going to be a cave-in on the piles that they were working on to try to save lives of rescue workers. When we look down at the Pentagon, personnel deploy a quick reaction task force to set up communications infrastructure away from the Pentagon so that everybody who's supposed to be working in this damaged portion of the building, the survivors who should have been working there, can continue their missions unimpeded while search and rescue efforts were underway. And so, of course, the September 11th terrorist attacks thrust us then into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The personnel at Fort Monmouth are, supporting those operations, everything from radars to night vision goggles and sights, all of the electronics that go in tanks and planes and drones eventually. So they're all being shepherded by the team at Fort Monmouth in one way or another. And so sometimes when people say to me, oh, well, they closed Fort Monmouth because what they were doing there wasn't really important. No, that is not the case. So Fort Monmouth winds up getting closed because of something called base realignment and closure. It's not a bad idea, right? The idea with base realignment and closure is that the Department of Defense should periodically look at its real estate holdings and see if there's any waste. Is there anything we should get rid of because we don't need it anymore? And can we consolidate mission? So the concept is not a bad one. I think that unfortunately, the list of what is going to get closed is actually decided is not always fair, let's say. So Fort Monmouth had been discussed for possible closure going back to the 70s, several times. This is a Save the Fort Asbury Park Press article from the 70s, right? So we had been suggested for closure many times, but when you are suggested for closure, you have the opportunity to argue your way off the list, to say why you shouldn't close, why you can't do your critical missions elsewhere without disruption to the warfighter, et cetera, et cetera. We had always argued our way off the list before. In the lead up to BRAC 2005, many people assume we will again argue our way off the list, but it's not to be. This time, despite the fact that we are intimately involved in supporting operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, the base is slated for closure. Now, I know some of you are very familiar with the base. For those of you who aren't, at this point, the Army's undergone a lot of complicated reorganizations. So we're not the home of the Signal Corps. The main entity that lives at Fort Monmouth at this point is something known as the Communications Electronics Command. And then think of Fort Monmouth like a town. There are a lot of other businesses that live in the town, if you will. So there's the Communications Electronics Command, which is the, successor kind of to the Signal Corps. But then like the FBI has offices there. The United States Military Academy Preparatory School had some buildings there, right? So we've really been focused on this Communications Electronics Command piece. The idea was everybody's got to leave, go somewhere. So the prep school, the Military Academy Prep School, goes to West Point. The big nut, right, the Communications Electronics Command, they were told you have to take that to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Go do the job there. Most employees, most of whom are civilian at this point, as I noted, they get what's called the transfer of function, and they're told, you know, you can go to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Some do, some don't. Initially, a lot of people are in denial. A lot of people are saying they're not leaving New Jersey. But then, of course, we have the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, which makes it so that a lot of people who thought they could retire or get jobs elsewhere couldn't and were forced to go. So it's a very wrenching time for people who worked at the base. Interestingly, they build a brand new campus for the Communications Electronics Command at Aberdeen Proving Ground to the cost of like $1 billion to save money by closing Fort Monmouth. But that's enough about that. And so, you know, they close the base and they take the museum and they take the archive. But as I said, this is our Monmouth County history. This is our New Jersey history. The work that was done by the men and women who worked there, military and civilian, saved lives around the globe, right? In training those uniformed military, it saved lives around the globe, and technologies that were developed there saved lives around the globe. Oh, and impacted the way we all live our lives. There were some 4,000 patents issued to men and women who worked at Fort Monmouth. And like I said, just take out your phone, right? So early weather forecasting comes from Fort Monmouth. Not solely, I'll share credit, right? There are others who are involved, but right, early weather forecasting. The idea that we have something like Find My Friends app, that comes out of a technology known as Blue Force Tracking, which was intended to let soldiers on the battlefield see on a screen where different enemy and friendly forces were. When we look at all of these different technologies, we are reminded of what we here in Monmouth County contributed, not just to the military, but to humanity. So thank you so much. As I said, it could be a semester-long class, but I will call it a day there, and I would be happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Yes.